Next weekend, not this weekend, Terra will be going down in Europe, Europe's first major of the year, and it's absolutely stacked with talent from all over the world. It's the tournament that I personally have been the most excited about for the entire year. But there's been a slight issue with the final seeding of Top 64, which was revealed a few days ago. Namely, some people have accused the Terra TOs of sabotaging North American players with bad matchups in their bracket path. Are these accusations true? Let's go over them for a second. But before we do that, just a reminder that if you want to support me monetarily, links to both my Patreon and my channel memberships are in the description. Alright, let's go ahead and get started with some context. Terra is a big deal for the world of Smash Ultimate, as this is one of the only times that Europe, not North America, has been the site of a massive tournament. The NA and EU Smash scenes are so separate these days, they almost feel like different games. For the majority of the game, players from the EU come over to NA in order to compete at the top level. Of course, caught in the middle of all this is Japan, the third of the world's major Smash scenes, who is in a similar boat as Europe, not having overseas competitors come over to Japan very often, and even European competitors for that matter. If Japanese players want to compete with players from other regions, they have to be the ones to leave. We saw this trend break for Kagaribi 10, one of the only times where Europe and NA flocked into Japan instead of the other way around. But honestly, perhaps Japan and Europe aren't a fair comparison to make. After all, Japanese players have a very clear incentive to come to other regions and travel abroad for tournaments. Money. When you win a tournament in NA, you can win money from that tournament, something that is actually outlawed in Japan, which is why big Japanese tournaments usually have prizes consisting of a custom controller or something, and why Japanese players rely on sponsors to make a living. This condition isn't shared by Europe, which is why we see even less Europeans come over to NA to compete, hence why Terra is so important. This is one of the only times where Europe is the main stage, and the Japanese/NA crowd are on their home turf, not the other way around. Europe is no doubt excited to prove themselves on the world's main stage, especially when the European scene is so separated from the rest of Smash that many consider them an inferior region. Think of Tony Z Tank, for instance. However, have the Terra TOs gotten a little bit too desperate to make their scene shine? That brings us back to the accusations of bracket rigging against the Terra TOs to sabotage North American players with bad matchups in order to make them lose early. These NA players are seeded over these players, yes, but it would seem like NA players have a high probability of getting upset early. What am I talking about? Let's go into details. Here is the top 64 seeding for Terra. Looking at this, people were quite honestly stumped for a second, and I don't blame them. There are certainly some odd decisions. I don't know about you all, but when I look at this seeding, the first thing that stands out to me is having Tweak as the second seed and only having one European, Siski, in the top 8 seeds. Siski actually wasn't the 8th seed before this, that spot belonging to Apollo Kage until he decided to DQ. Now, I think for the most part, this seeding is fine, but there were certain spots that made people curious, so they started digging. And what did they find? They found that Tweak, Zomba, and Light all had been seeded into terrible matchups for their character, with the possible exception of Tweak, which we'll get into. The Terra TOs may even be trying to sabotage Spargo, but for now, let's start with Tweak. Tweak is seeded to fight Maze Beans in the first set of Top 64, who, as we all know, plays Steve. This may or may not be a losing matchup for Diddy Kong, it's really up to interpretation, and Tweak hasn't made a Diddy matchup chart in a hot minute. However, it is well known that Tweak personally struggles against Steves, with even Steve players at locals taking games off of Tweak and taking him to game 5s. This may suggest a problem against Steve on the side of Tweak, which many argue that the Terra TOs are taking advantage of in an attempt to sabotage Tweak's bracket. And while that matchup may be up for debate, Light and Zomba definitely are seeded into losing matchups. Light is seeded to fight Luigi, winner of Regen 2023 and the 14th seed in Top 32. Luigi is considered a -2 matchup for Fox by Light himself, and back when Elegant was still competing and still considered the best Luigi in the world, Light was only ever able to take one set off of him, their last one at Super Smash Con 2022. Even though Light is seeded to beat Luigi, it's not hard to see that Light could easily lose here, where he would then have to fight Quick, Bloom Forever, and Siski to make top 8, having to beat 2 of the best Samuses in the world, not to mention one of the top 5 EU players in Bloom Forever. Speaking of Bloom Forever, Zomba is seeded to fight Bloom Forever in Top 32. Bayonetta is also considered a -2 for Rob, being on par with Mr. Game & Watch and Aegis. We can see this matchup dominance in other players like Deathspade's excellent record over Epic Gabriel, just to name one example. It's once again easy to imagine Zomba loses here, which if he does, he would have to face Luigi or Siski, 2 of the best top 5 players in Europe. For many, it seems as though the Terra TOs are setting up Zomba and Light with -2 matchups, and then once they lose those, sending them into a gauntlet of top European players, who all play characters like Luigi, Bayonetta, or Samus. All of this doesn't even mention the fact that if Light and Zomba win both of these -2 matchups, they would have to fight each other in the winner's side top 8 qualifier. This ensures that one of these Americans has to enter top 8 from loser's side, if they even make top 8 at that point. And if Light and Zomba both lose these -2 matchups, then they would have to face one another in losers as well, as long as Light beats Quick, that is. One fascinating matchup in regards to Terra is the fact that Spargo and Siski are supposed to fight for winner's side top 8, a matchup that we just saw at Delfino Mazza 2023, where Siski barely lost the set in one of the closest Game 5s of the year. And so, you could make the argument that the Terra TOs are trying to sabotage Spargo here. But the problem is that seeding is a long process that takes a long time, especially with this many entrants. I'd be willing to bet that this match was seeded to happen well before Delfino Mazza even hosted that set between Spargo and Siski. So now I've laid out everything that many people on Twitter have pointed out, so we now get to the pivotal question. Is this just how the bracket turned out, or is this deliberate bracket rigging by the Terra TOs in order to sabotage NA players and make Europeans seem better than they really are? Now, that's a loaded question, but I'll give you my thoughts on it. First of all, it's important to remember that seeding is both supposed to be a ranking of who the TOs think will win the tournament, and seeding is supposed to avoid past matchups that we've already seen at other tournaments. For the most part, these European players and North American players have never fought, and I, for one, would rather see our NA players get bad matchups with new players rather than fight players they've fought before. Secondly, I think it's important to remember that these sets that I've been talking about are near the top 8, either being qualifiers for top 8 or just outside top 8 qualifiers. These players would have had to face one another eventually, and needless to say, it would be quite literally impossible to make a bracket where someone doesn't get screwed over with a bad matchup, especially in today's meta of dual maining and secondaries. Maybe it was just Light and Zomba's turn to get that bad bracket. I read a lot of tweets, and therefore a lot of takes, regarding this seeding, and I saw some counter arguments from the European crowd that I want to bring up and discuss. The first take I saw was players claiming that, well, Gluttony always gets bad matchups when he comes to the States, and you don't see us complaining. This is something that I hadn't considered before, but it is indeed true that Gluttony fights T quite often whenever he travels, or that Gluttony has fought 2 Sonic players recently, fighting Sonics at Smash Factor X and Ken at Delfino Mazza 2023. The only problem here is that there's a good chunk of these sets that weren't seeded to happen. For a recent example, Ken versus Gluttony only happened because Shiny Mark upset Gluto in winner's quarters. If Gluto doesn't get upset by Shiny Mark, he likely never fights Ken. Seeding never holds up once the tournament starts, after all, which is something that I'll cover again at the end. However, when I read this argument, even though the point they're trying to make has a basis to it, I don't think seeding should ever be done on a revenge basis. I don't think any TO should say to themselves, oh well, those dirty Americans seeded Gluto into bad matchups, so we're gonna do the same. I can't say with certainty that this did or didn't happen, but I will say that it seems childish and therefore unlikely that the Terra TOs seeded Zomba and Light into these bad matchups specifically for revenge for Gluttony or any other European player getting a bad matchup at an NA major. I also don't think that, just because European players have had bad brackets before, that should prevent us from asking questions and looking deeper into things. If Terra's seeding was indeed sabotaged intentionally, that is a bad thing, and we should all ask questions and look into things that we find suspicious in order to prevent any form of foul play. I don't think anyone should be gatekept from asking about something we find weird just because Gluto had to fight a lot of Sonic players in the past. The other argument I wanted to bring up is the idea that this isn't a big deal for one specific reason, that these players should just win the matchup anyways. The logic, as this argument claims, is that if Light or Zomba can't even win one bad matchup, then they don't deserve to make top 8 at a prestigious tournament like Terra, and therefore deserve to lose. This argument was fascinating to me. It is certainly true that if you play Ultimate, you will inevitably face a bad matchup, no matter who you play. Even Sonic players will have to fight an Aegis or a Fox eventually, and even Pikachus will eventually have to fight a Game & Watch, even Steves will eventually have to fight a Cloud, and so on and so forth. It is absolutely true that bad matchups are a part of this game, and working around these matchups and solving them is a large part of getting better with your character, and some would say is one of the most fun parts of improvement. I would certainly say that in order for someone to be considered a top player, they should definitely have enough fundamental skills in the game to work through a single bad matchup. So in this regard, I actually think these people making this argument have a decent point. However, I am against us purposefully pitting top players against bad matchups to sort of test them. I am against us going, here, Light, you must face the best Luigi in the world, and if you don't win this -2 matchup, you do not deserve top 8. I'm against that practice, and I think you probably would be too if it happened to you. Because imagine if you went to your local and the TO told you, hey, old sport, you know that player who plays your worst matchup that you've lost to 5 times before? They're your round 1. If you can't beat them, you don't deserve to make top 8. That would be insane to do intentionally. The same thing goes for majors. Bad matchups will happen, especially if you're a solo main like Light or Zomba. They're gonna eventually happen, but let them happen naturally. It is an objectively bad thing for a TO to rig a bracket in order to test these players. Now, is that what's happening at Terra? Again, I can't say with certainty. I'm just giving my thoughts here about this idea of a player deserving top 8, which is such a subjective word. Deserve, very subjective. And in fact, I would challenge every single one of you to come up with a definition for what a player must do to deserve top 8 that every single other commenter would agree with. You can't do it. So that brings us back to our original topic. Did the Terra TOs purposely sabotage NA players with bad matchups in their brackets? And the answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure. Certainly lots of people in the comments of this very video will debate at length whether or not the TOs rigged the bracket or not, but for me personally, I can't say it with certainty either way. I can't read minds, and therefore it's impossible for me to know the truth of the matter unless the TOs themselves confirm or deny, and even then, people probably wouldn't believe them. The only thing I'm here to do is bring the points to you all, lay out the evidence as objectively as I can, and pass the ball to you all to decide for yourselves whether or not you believe this seeding is rigged or not. Many people would argue that there are simply too many coincidences for it to be not intentional, and many others would argue that it really is just coincidence. Again, I'm just here to bring you the evidence and you decide for yourself. But let me leave you with just one more thing, one last question to ponder. Does any of this really matter? As we've seen with recent tournaments like Regen 2023, where only half of the top 8 seeds made top 8, tournaments rarely go by their seeding. Think of Spargo getting 65th at Super Smash Con as the first seed, or Shiny Mark getting 3rd at Delfino Mazza as the 13th seed. Seeding never holds up exactly, and I think there's a really good chance that all of these problem matchups that we've been talking about today end up not happening at all, simply because we live in an era of bloodshed in Smash Ultimate, and upsets are gonna happen. So the whole video, this whole argument, may end up meaning nothing at all. No matter how the bracket goes, you all better believe that I'll be there to cover it. That's going to be it for today's video. Before I go, shout out to my patrons, Death Laster and FireSkull333, as well as my YouTube members, Stormtrooper, Loco Soko, Mattoon, Roropoke, Chavo, DTR Jr., and my tier 2 members, Mike G and Eddie K. Additionally, thanks to gifted members Dane H, Zesta, Jake M, Renzuke, Interesting YouTube Observer, Undutiful Hades 6, Neo, Renario Uwu, Sal, Serix, Anna S, Kyle the Piplup, Elib918, Spooks' Little Devil, HSF, The Seraph, Hans, Neon Citro, Knuckles the Echidna, and Otaku. Until tomorrow, I've been Mr. Mice, and thank you all so much for watching.